everyone. I'm John Lynn, the founder of the Life Sciences Today podcast, part of the Healthcare IT Today community. We're happy to bring you valuable life sciences insights and perspectives. And today, we're excited to sit down with Carter Dredge. He's Executive Director of the Intermountain Health Institute. Welcome, Carter.
Thanks, John. I'm happy to be here. And looking forward to our discussion.
Yeah, I mean, I think there's so much to talk about. We're not going to be able to fit it all into this podcast, so we might have you back. I'm doing that anticipatory because I've already heard you speak and know how much knowledge you have about this space. But anyway, before we dive into some of the unique and creative things that you and the Institute are doing, tell us a little bit about yourself and Intermountain Health Institute.
Sure, happy to. Professionally, I've been a chief strategy officer of a large health system, like 40,000 plus employees. I've been a divisional CEO of a large inside of another health system, and I've done finance. That's professionally, and I've also been co-founder of numerous large-scale national businesses, and we'll talk about those later. Educationally, I have a business management finance degree from BYU.
Yeah.
Have a master's. Yeah.
Go Cougs. Yeah, I love having BYU grads.
There we go. Absolutely. And then I've got a master's degree in health administration from Cornell, University of New York. And then I have a doctorate in business from the University of Cambridge in the UK.
Wow.
So there you go.
That's awesome. I mean, what a interesting background, and I love that you have that experience. How about the Intermountain Health Institute?
Yeah. So the Intermountain Health is a large integrated multi-state delivery system. 68,000 people. It's an exceptional place to work. I work directly for the CEO, Rob Allen. And the Intermountain Health Institute is really an umbrella that encapsulates several different institutes inside of Intermountain. One of them is the Leadership Institute, where we train leaders on character-based leadership. That was formed by the previous CEO, Dr. Charles Sorensen. Another is a brand new institute, which we will be talking a little bit about today, and we'll be able to share more as time goes on, something called the Mindshare Institute. And this is about developing a whole new series of businesses like Civica and Civica Script, which we'll talk about today on this podcast. And then it also encapsulates the strategic aspects of the Healthcare Delivery Institute, which is about quality improvement. So it's an umbrella term. And today we'll really focus a whole lot more about how do we build new businesses like Civica and Civica Script.
Yeah. So, I mean, as I said, we could talk about a lot of different angles. You're doing a lot of creative things. And Intermountain, of course, is a leader in so many aspects of healthcare IT. And now I think that was what was interesting for me. And I wanted to definitely have you on. Is like, I'd love to hear, why did Intermountain kind of decide to get into the pharma and life sciences business? I know when we saw the headline, Intermountain doing generic drugs, we were like, what? Like, help us understand that thought process and how it came together.
Yeah, happy to, John. So, this was years ago, and we saw what we would just call a market failure. We had a lot of these drug shortages. I mean, there's 250 plus drugs, generic drugs on shortage at any one given time in the United States. Our pharmacy teams are running around trying to figure out how to get access to these drugs, which we use every day. They're essential. We also were seeing some other things going on, like with Martin Shkreli, and that, while unethical, was not illegal. He did go to jail, but for other stuff.
Yeah.
EpiPen, a few things like this, and there's several of us that stepped back and said, "Is there something we can do about this?" And particularly, I want to give credit to a dear friend and colleague of mine, Dan Leonquist, who's the Chief Strategy Officer at Intermountain, who had this idea of, what if we could aggregate the demand for these drugs and really think about injecting a new type of supply into the market? I was one of the first few people that Dan talked about this idea, and we started working on it. And we, like many kind of, if you will, entrepreneurial endeavors, it was late in the evening, early, and we were just talking about what can we do as a healthcare system that needs access to these drugs, and we didn't have an option. So many of us, we have a strong action bias, not just whine about it, but we're going to do something. So we aggregated a group together, and we got to work. And I could go into as many details as we like as we go, but to bottom line it, why did we do it? It's because we felt we had to, because the problems that we were facing were not getting resolved in the marketplace as is.
Yeah. Well, and I think what's interesting is that you decided, hey, we shouldn't just go alone with this, but we should bring in a bunch of other partners. So talk to us about, what makes Civica RX, which is the RX platform. And maybe you can talk about the differences of the different Civica options that you have, but
Yeah.
how is that different than a traditional life sciences company? And to me, one of those aspects is you went and got a bunch of customers and as part of it, from the beginning, which is like almost the opposite of every startup in the world, right? Let's create a product and then go find customers. You went and found customers and said, let's create a product. So anyway, talk to us more about how it's different than a traditional life sciences company.
Yeah, it is. It is very different. And it was so different in many ways. Shortly after doing this, it wasn't too much longer when that's one of the reasons I went back to Cambridge to get a doctorate degree, was because I wanted to study it in a way of why it operated the way it did. But more on that in a bit. But to start out, how is it different? We use a term to describe what we did here is what's called disruptive collaboration. Now, there's a common term called disruptive innovation that I think people hear all the time, and that was really popularized by Clayton Christensen from Harvard. And that's when you have an entrant that comes up with a new way of doing something. The examples of, hey, we can print from home, personal computers, all these types of things. Some sort of breakthrough technology that figures out how to serve more people, get groups that are underserved, and then ultimately displace an incumbent. Disruptive collaboration is really where in some cases we had a mature product, but what we needed was a new structure. We didn't necessarily come up with a new product. We came up with a new company, and we actually worked together. So, as you're an expert, you cover the life sciences industry, John, and pharmaceutical production is an economies of scale play. And so Intermountain is a very large organization. It's one of the largest health systems in the United States. But compared to the entire United States and compared to the US generics market, Intermountain is small in that space. So we realized if we were going to enter at scale, we needed to bring others with us. And we weren't going after drugs that had really high margins. We weren't trying to develop the cure for cancer. We were trying to deliver essential medicines at the lowest sustainable cost. So this was a problem that wasn't attracting traditional capital. Just imagine the proposition of going to maybe a traditional capital source. It's like, all right, here's the deal. We are going to intentionally produce a commodity, right?
And it has low margin.
Yeah, it has low margins. Right? And oh, by the way, and it's going to get even tougher in terms of competition as soon as we enter, and and it's going to cost a lot of money to do it. And it's kind of a difficult value prop. But yet, as an end customer, we needed these drugs. It was a critical input to our business. One quick patient story, if we can always try it back to the patient, it gives even more color about why we did this. We were talking with some of these systems. This is like pre-formation of Civica. And we were talking with a health system who shared a pretty heartbreaking story with us. They talked about there was a patient that couldn't get access to a medication. It was one of these shortage medications. And they got admitted to the hospital. And the hospital couldn't get it. And the hospital had this patient stay as long as possible. And eventually they had to discharge the patient. And the patient looked at their kind of situation, seeing they couldn't get it, the hospital couldn't get it. Patient went up on a 10-story building and jumped off of it. And just heartbreaking. So we kind of said we got to do something different. So here's some of the things we did that were different. When we first started, we said we're going to pool together the customers of these businesses, people who are end users. And by doing that, we have the ability then to, instead of thinking about increasing the price, we can actually reduce the price because we're making drugs that we're going to use ourselves. And that's how we did financing too. So very different. We didn't have any bank financing. We had no venture capital financing. Everything was balance sheet finance from the health systems and philanthropists. So here you have philanthropists engaged in an entrepreneurial endeavor. And when we launched the business, we raised $100 million.
Wow.
70 million from health systems, 30 million from philanthropists, and we capitalized a new business. And day one, we had 500 hospitals engaged. So we were nothing, no business. We have a business, 500 hospitals. It
Wow.
was a fascinating dynamic, but because the products were established, we knew what we wanted to get. We had stable demand. We de-risked, are people going to buy it? And so technical risk was minimal, purchasing risk was minimal, all these types of things. Marketing
Yeah, they
risk, we
knew how
already
much
had.
of each product they wanted. Like you literally knew what the demand would be generally.
Yes,
That's
we did. So
fascinating.
yeah, so it was the very opposite of many ways that you formed a business. And then as soon as what we also decided was because we were dealing with a shortage situation, the pricing was really, it was transparent. And guess what? It was simple. Everyone got the exact same price.
Mm.
Because the goal was to drive a shortage. The goal wasn't to create a competitive advantage. And so everyone got the same price. That's why we refer to these businesses as healthcare utilities, because it's not about discriminating on price on every different group. It says it performs a stabilizing function. And everyone got the same price. And so he's like, yeah, it's kind of like a utility. And then the one last thing I'd mention is, but it's even so, it's transparent, single low price, no owners, nonprofit, debt financed, non-equity financed, but yet it operates in the market. It's not a governmental intervention. It has a CEO, it has a management team, it has a board of directors. And so it operates in the market, but in a very different way. And so those are just a few of the highlights of how Civica operates very, very differently than a traditional life sciences company.
Yeah, let's talk more about the economic dynamics. I mean, you're the economist here, not me. And you highlighted some of them. And what are the economics dynamics at play? My favorite is that, like, as you add more people, you actually lower the cost because you have economies of scale. Whereas in every other business, if you were to create a monopoly, you'd actually increase because then that you could, right? That's what
Totally.
the market would allow, right? And so tell me about some of those economic dynamics that are unique to Civica Rx.
Oh, sure, John. What an astute question. Um, Most of the time, the question that maybe a company might ask is, what is the price that the market will bear?
Mm.
And you're trying to look for that equilibrium in that way. And we asked almost an inverted question. We said, what is the lowest sustainable cost that we can deliver the product to over time? And so that it's different. So because the producers are the customers, you can actually orient it all about cost. Because normally you have a group that's producing something that they're selling to a different group. And so therefore, if you're selling something, you normally want to sell it for the highest price you can. And if you're buying it, you want to buy it at the lowest price that you can. Well, if you're buying it and you're selling it, you can then choose to orient that one way or the other. And we oriented it towards lowest overall cost. So, and because also with the economics, by using debt as the mechanism, like this was this was like a 20-year note. It was more like a mortgage to build a business to have a long-term strategy. Again, no exit. So we're not trying to create any type of liquidation event. We put debt capital and philanthropic capital on the books, and the goal was to drive long-term sustainability. And because of that, as we add more scale, you mentioned this, we pool more volume, we get more economies of scale, and therefore we're able to go back and actually lower the price. I'll never forget how interesting it was when we would go and meet with some of these members, and they didn't ask for it, but we came back and were like, by the way, the prices on these drugs are going to be lower. and and it was like their eyes got really big, and they're like, wait, hold on a second,
No
like
one's ever said that to
like
us.
what's the catch? And we're like, well, here's the catch. Like, you're a member, we're a member. It doesn't do us any good to do this. A few other important nuances about how those economics really stayed true is one, we put philanthropists on the board.
Mm.
So not only did we raise money from them, they're board members, voting board members. And if we ever and if the company ever gets sold, one, it's designed not to be sold.
Mhm.
But to some extent, if there was ever some reason where it had to be, like maybe the market completely changed and it wasn't selling it for a profit, but it wasn't there, all the proceeds go to charity. So if there's no real reason to house excess margin in the business, you're not trying to build a business to exit it. In the end, you build it to sell really high quality products at the lowest cost possible. Because we just didn't want to ever run into a situation where we couldn't get the product.
Mm. I mean, it's amazing the juxtaposition of what you just described and the questions you ask, right? Like how cheap can we sell this in a sustainable way, right? Like that is a very different question than how much will the market bear. And juxtapose that with the famous quote, I don't know if you remember seeing this, where someone said, at a pharma company, was like, no one asks how much it costs when grandma's on the gurney. I don't know if you ever heard that phrase. It's like, which is like the opposite of what you just said, which is, hey, we want to offer the lowest cost because it's true. No one does ask how much it costs when grandma's on the gurney, right? So, I mean, it's what an amazing new perspective that I think you guys offered that's really powerful and really beautiful. So I love that.
Oh, thank you. Yeah, I mean, yeah, you're hitting at something where it's like when something has, and again, I don't want to nerd out too much here, but I'm sure we're talking to a sophisticated audience,
Yeah,
right?
for
There's
sure.
many things that people have that in economic terms have inelastic demand, right? It's like price goes up, the demand stays the same, right?
Yeah,
If you need something to live or not massively suffer, you're going to pay it.
yeah.
And so we were taking we said, well, when something is a standard of care and it's a mature and it's well off patent, then that's almost like try to carve out some ensure competition on those inelastic services because we feel we have like an almost like an institutional responsibility to do that. Um, can I add in one more thing here
Yeah,
about this
absolutely.
importance about in the market? And this is where, so I talk and have many colleagues that are like in the business of developing novel therapeutics. We say we're not in the business of curing cancer. There are people who are in the business of curing cancer.
Yep.
And one of the reasons we like this approach through Civica and these type of market entities is it allows us to do both types of innovation. So I spent a lot of time in Europe. And in some of those contexts, like certain aspects of they've been socialized, and to some extent, it shaves off a little bit of the edge from an entrepreneurial incentive. And what we're trying to say is we need innovators to break boundaries of what's possible. And those innovators are taking risk, and there can be a risk premium. And then we're coming in on the back end and saying, this is off patent. This is well established. This is standard of care. And in that case, how do we match the structure with the phase or the maturity of the innovation?
Mm.
And if we do that well, what happens is we can use the market to create new products, and we use the market to make old products more available and more affordable. But we can use the market to do both. And that I think is a very different approach to how countries it's almost like they're picking one or the other. And we've kind of got stuck in the tyranny of the or. And I think we need to get more at the power of the and. And that's what we're trying to unlock within that almost like life sciences life cycle, if you will.
Yeah, well, and I think it's how healthcare should be approached, right? Because we do need the innovation and we need to reward the innovators that are taking the risk, but we also need to understand the inelasticity of treatment of standard of care. So
Yes.
beautifully said. I'd
Oh,
love to hear an example or, example or two of the impact of this work. You shared a patient story, which was super impactful, but, how has this changed really change the reality of supply chain for these, generic drugs for a health system. Any good examples you could share of that?
Absolutely. So I'm going to talk about one with Civica Rx and one with Civica Script, and
Okay.
talk about the differences. These are these
Perfect.
two life science healthcare utilities out there. So first, so Civica Rx, this is the one formed with hospitals. Started with the 500 hospitals. We have over 1,500 hospitals engaged now. About a third of the entire U.S. inpatient hospital market capacity is engaged.
Amazing.
And during COVID, there was times when the only source we could get some of these drugs from was Civica. Not that we
Wow.
were just augmenting. Many of the
No.
drugs to treat COVID patients were some of these essential pharmaceuticals that we produced at Civica, and the demand surged 400, 500%. And there literally was times where the only place our hospital members could get access to these drugs was Civica Rx.
Wow, that's
It was
amazing.
it was fascinating. And then there was several other instances when people were donating different products and things like that. We got approached by several agencies and they said, "Can you distribute these products throughout your network? Because we know that you're kind of a nonprofit focused on this." And we did that. And one of the reasons we could do that is because also different from a traditional business, maybe that's really, again, we're trying to focus on access maximization, cost minimization. We carry 6 months of safety stock
Wow.
at, at Civica.
That's
That is
different than the business.
millions and millions of dollars of product, right?
Right.
Because for us, like running out it's like a never event. And so we just operated that business very differently. So in the case of, so we do have some empirical research on this. There's a paper that's called Vaccinating Supply Chains Against Failure. And this is where we talk about the access benefits, because really Civica Rx was very much about an access benefit for
Hmm.
essential inpatient drugs. So that's one example. Let me
Okay.
give you another example. With Civica Script, we were going after some of these, again, off patent, but still prohibitively expensive drugs. Now, if you remember how we talked about how a healthcare utility works, you want to match the customers and the producers together. So in this case, hospitals are not the customers of these retail drugs.
Mm.
These are patients going to pick them up at your local pharmacy in a retail setting.
Yep.
So we actually did not intentionally, we chose not to raise money from hospitals to solve a retail drug problem, because otherwise that group would have had a little bit of an incentive because they're no longer the customer, right? So you really want to have this tight customer producer incentive. So we actually worked with health plans. And we
Mm.
went out and we aggregated relationships with 23 health plans, made it really anchored by Blue Cross Blue Shield plans. And the Blue Cross Blue Shield Association was just really central in helping coordinate this. And by doing that, and because the consumer pays and the insurance company pays on many of these high cost drugs, the insurance company pays a little bit more than the consumer. And we were able to do it through institutional purchasing rather than crowd financing. It's really hard to crowd finance like tens of millions or hundreds of millions of dollars. But we could do it through these predominantly nonprofit, but Blues plans and others. And by doing that, we picked a prototype drug, a drug called abiraterone. Abiraterone is a drug to treat metastatic prostate cancer.
Mm.
And it was selling for around $3,000 in the market off patent. And we talked to some of our R&D folks and we're like, "Do you think we could make this cheaper?" And they're like, "Oh yeah." They're like, "Definitely." So we aggregated the scale. We started putting together the process. We ultimately now we sell that product on the open market for $171. Okay, and a dramatic, 90% decrease in cost for this when you average it out across all the patients and all the different plan structures. We got a peer review study. In that case, it talks about changing the script and kind of drugs. And so we got some of these little fun little titles out there, and we'll
You
make sure that
should.
we can give you links. But So yeah, we've reduced that, 90%. And because we just approach it from a different orientation. So those are just a couple examples of some of the successes we've been able to see. In one case, we've delivered medicines to almost 100 million people. And in another case, we have almost 100 million people or over 100 million people covered, which we're now delivering medicines to at a 90% discount.
That's so amazing. I mean, what a different way to think about it. And to your point, it's off patent. There's a lot of opportunity there for the right approach. What should a life sciences company, a pharma company, what should they understand about Civica's efforts? Because I think that will be something that's of interest to them. Like how do they, kind of look at you and consider what you're doing?
Yeah, while it may seem counterintuitive, as I talk with many of our like kind of novel breakthrough kind of R&D efforts from friends or colleagues that we have, as I say, I view this as a way to protect and encourage breakthrough innovation.
Mm,
Let me unpack that a little bit more.
yeah.
Like, to some extent, what we have a little bit in the United States is that we're paying premium prices almost into perpetuity in some instances. And no economy in the world can afford that, even the United States. But we need this innovation engine of producing new medicines and new cures and new devices, et cetera. And so the way that we view it is to say, once this thing is really super mature, let's make sure that it can be sustainable. We're not trying to drop the price to the point where it's not sustainable. It has to be sustainable or it doesn't work. We're
Sure.
also not trying to displace incumbents. We're trying to inject competition. So that our goal is not focused on market share. Our goal is focused on market impact.
Hmm.
So that if there's adequate competition and there's like a sustainable and a reasonable margin, there's no need for us to enter, right? It's when there's either not a sufficiently robust supply chain because everyone is moving upstream into a higher margin product, and then it's almost like the residual is getting left behind, then we're going to enter. Or when there's something that is so egregiously priced above what its long-term operating cost structure is beyond the patent period that it almost is warranted entry from a responsibility perspective. But if we do this well as a country and we could free up dollars, those dollars can be applied to novel innovation. Those dollars can get applied to break through more boundaries. And in fact, to some extent, it might speed the adoption because we can't necessarily as a society sit on our laurels. We're like, that was a super great idea 40 years ago and it's still a cash cow. We're like, maybe we need the next really good idea. And
Yeah.
so our whole goal is to bring competition to areas where it's not working. And in fact, this Mindshare Institute that I've referenced, and again, there's more and more that we'll talk about over time in the months ahead. The purpose statement of the Mindshare Institute is solving market failures that are hurting people.
Mm,
So our focus is not about where is there a profit margin on a product stream. Our focus is where is the market failing and where are those failures resulting in patient or basically individual harm. That's where we're focused.
Yeah, so tell us more about that. I mean, you kind of gave us the teaser of Mindshare and Mindshare Institute. Do you have a timeline behind it? Talk
Sure.
to us more about the purpose, and is it going to be across life sciences, health IT, workflow, finance, supply chain? I mean, there's so many areas of healthcare we could probably talk about. Uh, I think everyone in healthcare understands the dysfunction of healthcare. So, tell us more about the timeline, purpose, goals, what you're
Sure.
looking at.
Yes, happy to do it. So a few things. So I mean, we have assembled a small team, and that some of that work is beginning now. Um, as we're also assembling really influential partners. And so I'm not at liberty at this moment to disclose who those partners are yet,
Sure.
but I can give you a little bit more detail about what we're trying to do. So again, if you have an idea for a new product or service, you have, many of those channels are, you're going to go raise venture capital, or you're going to go raise seed capital. Maybe it's something involved with it already exists but needs to scale up in private equity, or maybe you're working through traditional joint ventures and other structures like that. When you have a Civica type idea, where do you go? There is not a place for you
Don't
to
go.
go right now. And so, and Civica and Civica Script, phenomenal successes, all of them were built off the side of the desk. They were built by executives like me, Dan, and others who had full-time jobs but were so compelled to act that we burnt the midnight oil to make it happen. For this to become a more established genre or category of businesses, we need a more systemic way to build these healthcare utilities, these Civica-like businesses. That is the function of the Mindshare Institute, is we will create an incubation process where people can come, entrepreneurs that say, I have an idea to address a market failure, and I'm willing to set up my business as a nonprofit, non-stock company. And I need people to help me figure out how to do that and help build the business and not ask for equity, because I don't want to have equity on my business. We're providing a nonprofit, mega scale incubation process for mission-oriented entrepreneurs. That's one function. Another function we have is we will convene around these issues to see if there is a general agreement or consensus around where are the most egregious market failures. And we'll provide, if you will, to borrow a term from Governor Mike Leavitt, former governor of the state of Utah and former HHS Secretary of the United States, how can we provide almost like a convener of stature function, where we can bring things together and we can talk about issues openly of where there needs to be change. So building new businesses, convening around tough issues, and then as indicated in some of these publications, which we've already done, how do we show the impact and rigorously understand how it works, why it works, where it will work, where it will not work. So those are our three focus areas within Mindshare: building nonprofit, non-stock businesses to address and solve market failures that are hurting people, convening around critical societal issues where there's market failures, and then transparently publishing the research of how it's working and the thinking so that others can replicate and adopt it. That's in a nutshell what we're doing in Mindshare.
It's interesting when you say that. I imagine every person listening in healthcare is like, I know some dysfunction I'd love to deal with. So it's interesting you say that, or at least some misalignment of incentives that happens in healthcare. And it's interesting to focus on impact rather than ROI, which I think is a really interesting measure. You've used the phrase healthcare utility a lot. You've been working on this, obviously studied it. Tell us a little more about what it is and how it will how you think it will influence the future of healthcare.
Yeah, so if we think about when we use this term, disruptive collaboration is almost like collaboration to play offense instead of defense. That's maybe like the short thing. A healthcare utility is the combination of these elements that we've made into a business structure. So when I use this term healthcare utility, it's like, so we would say Civica is like, it's a healthcare utility focused on inpatient shortage medications. Civica Script is a healthcare utility focused on high cost retail medications. And so we use the healthcare utility language to talk about how a business is governed and structured, how it is financed, how it prices in the market, and how it basically works as a private entity. And so that's kind of the healthcare utility is shorthand for the business model of a non-stock, non-profit, national scale business that's focused on cost minimization, not profit maximization. That's the term. And if someone wants to go really deep there, Dan and I and my partner from Cambridge, Professor Stefan Scholtes, who is brilliant. He's a tenured professor at Cambridge, and
Hmm.
prior to doing healthcare work, he was a world-class mathematician. Um, was we published a paper called Disruptive Collaboration, and there we actually talk about how a healthcare utility works. It'd be a great resource for anyone that wants to learn more.
So was that your most recently published article with the professor from Cambridge?
The disruptive collaboration, actually that was one of the earlier ones where we talk about it. So we we have multiple publications. If I make it real simple, the very
Okay.
first one we published was on healthcare utilities, the healthcare utility model. That was
Okay.
kind of the first one. We were naming the language. The second one was on disruptive collaboration. It talks about more about how the business model works, where it could be applied, and gives some examples. That's probably the best single read for the strategy side of the business. Then
Okay.
we published empirical outcomes on Civica and about the impact on access. That's the vaccinating supply chain one. And then
Hmm.
the most recent one that came out about a week ago, that's the one about the 90% cost savings on the retail medicine and Civica script. And all of those are available. And we've wanted those findings to be, if you will, in the public domain. So
Carter, this is incredible. I mean, the work you and your team, and obviously a lot of other people involved at this point, really, cause us to rethink a lot of the. Well, it's funny, you're the economist, right? The economics of healthcare, right? It's such a interesting and unique way that you've done this, and I appreciate you kind of sharing the story behind it and some of the details to help people understand what you're doing.
well, thank you. I just have one thing to say on a personal front as
Yeah.
well, which I think maybe kind of helps anchor, maybe why I think the way I do.
Uh-huh. That'd be
Uh,
great.
John, my mom was paralyzed in a car accident before I was born. Never saw her walk. She was 15 years old, and in that same car accident, her mother, my grandmother, was killed. Um, the lady, she was on I-15 in the central part of Utah where she grew up, and the lady driving the car had a heart attack and tensed up, and she also passed away. But the car ultimately flipped off an overpass, landed upside down on railroad tracks. And again, my grandmother was killed. My mom was paralyzed, and she had a lot of health challenges in her life. So she's in her 40s and she was homebound because of how many challenges she had. And my grandfather helped take care of, he moved in to help take care of me when I'm a twin, me and my twin brother, and my mom had health challenges. And so my grandfather helped. And at the same time, crazy enough, John, this is a legit story, my great grandma moved in because
Wow.
my grandfather was taking care of her. So she was born in 1899 and she died in our house in 1994.
Wow.
So I grew up in 4 generations in one house. And so therefore, pretty much everybody in my house had major health challenges.
I was gonna say it sounds like a healthcare
It
household.
was a healthcare household. And so like it was almost like my aspiration as a kid of like, what could I do to help people like my mom or my grandpa or
Mm,
my great grandma? And I had a knack for business. And so the paradigm that I brought to many of these challenges is to say, if I help one person, does it help me help two?
mm,
And therefore, the only way we could do that is if we really wasn't just about a grant, because grants run out. It had to be a sustainable business. There's no way we would have gotten to serving, again, approaching 100 million people through Civica just on handouts. We had to have a replicable business to do it. And that's why I do what I do. And Intermountain does what it does because it has the mission of helping people live the healthiest lives possible.
yeah.
So these collaborative entities, they're not just Intermountain entities, but Intermountain has been critical in helping anchor and sustain them because it aligns with our mission of helping people live the healthiest lives possible. So that's why I'm in. That's why Intermountain's in. That's why these other organizations that I have extremely high respect for and admiration for, that's why they're in. because
Yeah.
it makes it better for patients. So anyways, I'm
I
pretty
love that.
passionate about it.
I love the personal story, Carter. I think we all have some sort of healthcare story that, makes us passionate about the work we do. But I appreciate that you and your team and the others involved are, too many people are focused on profiting off the dysfunction of healthcare. And the fact that you're focused on the impact that you can create using economic principles. I'm with you. I like sustainable economic models that can make an impact because they drive the best behaviors. So it's amazing that you're creating new ones that we hadn't thought about previously and making those a reality. So thank you so much for taking time to talk with us, Carter. And thanks everyone for watching and listening. If you want to find more great life sciences information, you can find it out at the Life Sciences Today podcast by Healthcare IT Today. Thanks, Carter.
Thank you.